Much like a raga or much like a musical score, the genome itself is lifeless. It's the cell that brings it to life. I think when you somatize the idea that a mental illness has a physical cause, you remove a lot of the stigma that is associated with that illness.
Hello everyone. In the beginning of his new book, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee quotes American poet Wallace Stevens, and the quote goes like this: "In the sum of the parts, there are only the parts. The world must be measured by I." These lines perhaps apply as much to the subject of the book as well as to Dr. Mukherjee himself, because he is indeed a man of many parts. The Indian American physician is not only an oncologist doing cutting-edge research in cancer cure, but he is also a cell biologist, a hematologist, an entrepreneur, and of course an author whose 2010 book, The Emperor of All Maladies, the biography of cancer, won the Pulitzer Prize in the category of general non-fiction. Dr. Mukherjee is in Bangalore today for the launch of his book, and we are at the Biocon campus to meet him. It is our pleasure and honor to have you here with us today, Doctor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Hope Bangalore is treating you well.
Excellent.
I must confess that I'm still reading the book. It's a fascinating book. I'll begin by asking about something that actually struck me initially. It's not often that a well-researched scholarly book, which promises to explore medicine and new human, as you put it, has such an eloquent title. You know, The Song of the Cell, and chapter names like Healing Cell, Contemplative Cell. You know, it's almost as if you are privy to some secret musical performance by the cells in our bodies. Where did this title come from? Is there some truth to this interpretation?
Well, so the title of the book came quite late in the book, in the sense that I had almost written the entire book. The book had a different title initially. And then I began to realize two things. One is that every cell in our bodies, the cells in our brain, neurons in our brain, T cells, B cells in our immune system, red blood cells, cells in our body, except for a few examples, essentially share the same genetic code, the human genome. But each cell takes that same human genome and makes a unique, I would say, song out of it. It's a little bit like if you give a musical score to one orchestra, it'll play one set tune. If you give the same musical score to another orchestra, it'll play another different tune. Or perhaps in Indian classical music, you have the same set of notes that comprise a raga. If you give it to one musician, you will get a completely different interpretation. Give it to another musician, he'll give a completely different interpretation, but the core is the same. Now, much like a raga or much like a musical score, the genome itself is lifeless. It's the cell that brings it to life by, in some ways, if you want to use a little bit of poetic license, by singing it out. Hence the song of the cell, because each cell is singing out really a different tune from the same score. And then the second interpretation, which also I realized sort of late in the book, is that we have a lot of understanding, a very deepened understanding of individual cells, but we are still trying to figure out how these pieces fit together. So a song is not just something that you hum internally, but it's also a communication between cells. The discerning cell, the tolerant cell, the contemplative cell, these are not sitting in a vacuum. They are coordinating their activities in the human body. And therefore, that's the second interpretation of the song.
So it's really like an orchestra.
It's almost like an orchestra, exactly. And therefore, again, the song of the cell.
In the beginning, you also introduce your idea of new human, and you make it clear that it's not like Keanu Reeves in a black Momo. It's not a science fiction character, but it's somebody, a human who is built anew, right? So, but whether it is, gene modification or cellular therapy, there's a lot of ethical and philosophical debates going on about it. And in fact, a lot of fear and skepticism also, even against science, I would say generally now. What is your stand on this? Where do you stand on this?
So, the last few chapters of the book are really dedicated to these kinds of fear, skepticism, ethical considerations, etc. In my second book, in the Gene and Intimate History, I really laid out almost a kind of triangle which I call the ethical triangle, within which we can operate and outside which we begin to run into trouble. Let me describe this ethical triangle to you. One edge of this ethical triangle is the concept of suffering and extraordinary suffering. In other words, we are doing all of these things. We are making radical interventions into human bodies, genetic interventions, cellular interventions. But the goal of these interventions, the first goal of these interventions is not augmentation, but rather the relief of suffering. So, people suffering from sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, cancer, autoimmune diseases, mental illnesses such as depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc., etc. These create an enormous amount of suffering for some people, but not for all. But for some people, infertility is a form of suffering. IVF, when it was first created, was so radical that we were bringing new babies into the world that were conceived in a dish. So one edge of the triangle is that what we are trying to do is solve extraordinary suffering. The second edge of the triangle is what I would call scientific confidence and safety. By confidence, I mean that the interventions that we're doing, we have a level of judgment and confidence that they are likely to alleviate the extraordinary suffering. They're not just done for the sake of doing them, and that they're safe, that they don't compromise the safety, and that there's almost when we perform these interventions, we do them after we've rigorously analyzed them, hopefully through rigorously unbiased clinical trials, and that have really inspired our own confidence. We've applied our own skepticism to them, and they have passed the concerns about skepticism. Right. The third is what I call the humanistic aspects of it. So patient consent, absence of fear, and absence of I would say mandates or state-specified pressures that patients might feel or individuals might feel to take part in all of this. That there should be choice, freedoms, and in fact and autonomy and agency. I think if all three conditions in this triangle are met, and we stay within the purview of these triangles, we're actually going to do some important good, medical good.
Absolutely. But there isn't very much public awareness about this kind of triangle, like you say.
Exactly. Well, the problem is that there isn't a lot of public awareness about it, and therefore there is a lot of fear and skepticism. But I think making the public aware of the idea that there are boundaries, and that science can and medicine can operate within these boundaries and successfully operate within these boundaries and alleviate extraordinary suffering is something that really needs to be communicated to the public.
In this context, you've recently spoken, very movingly about dealing with your own depression and also depression with cancer patients, caregivers, and in depression in general. And you also wrote about it in Maladies, about how doctors become indifferent to life and death, right? And when you wrote, actually you said in your article that when you were writing Song of the Cell, you were drowning in what you call dank joylessness. But then you looked at cells for an explanation instinctively. Could you elaborate a bit about how do you think researchers can, use cells to cure depression or even treatment of depression?
Yeah, so I mean, let's think a little bit about the complexities of mental illness, illness like depression. First of all, it can be very debilitating. People think, there's some kind of popular conception. It's sort of like, you're feeling sad. It's much more than that, much deeper. The sense of grief that won't pass, the inability to ever experience joy. It's very clear that there are psychosocial, situational things that initiate and modify mental illness such as depression. So in my case, it was the death of my father, and there were psychosocial elements, there were situational elements. And so no one, I think, is claiming, and certainly I'm not claiming, that the cause of depression is entirely sitting in your brain. But ultimately, and this is very important to realize, that ultimately these psychosocial, environmental, situational influences must modify or change mood regulating neurons, neuronal circuits, circuits of neurons, potentially hormonal circuits in your body, in your brain, and ultimately they impinge on these, and this is the mechanism by which you get the subjective feeling of the intensive grief, the inability to move, so-called psychomotor retardation of depression. I think when you somatize, and by somatize I mean bring to the body the idea that a mental illness has a physical correlate, has a physical cause, you begin to, number one, remove some of the stigma. Right. Because people say, you're depressed, slap yourself out of it, right? But you can't slap your neurons out of something. No one says slap your pancreas and now you'll cure your diabetes. No one says slap your cancer and you'll get out of your cancer. Once you understand that there's a physical, biological, chemical basis to an illness, you remove a lot of the stigma that is associated with that illness. That's one very important piece. The second piece is that you begin to understand it at a causal or mechanistic level. Once you begin to understand it at a causal and mechanistic level, you can begin to think about how you can use therapies against it, whether they be medical therapies, treatments, drugs, whether it be cognitive or behavioral therapy, so-called talk therapy with psychiatrists, whether it be deep brain stimulation, whether it be new kinds of medications and trials. You all of a sudden have a new way, a new lens by which you can look at even an illness that is mental illness. And I think all of these help towards the destigmatization, demystification, and ultimately, a kind of empathy towards the person who is undergoing this insoluble form of grief that we have recognized for millennia, which is depression.
You've also spoken recently about immortality, and there are many intriguing things that are being spoken about immortality now, and you've spoken in Maladies about how cancer cells also want to become immoral in a perverse sense. Today, there's a lot of casual talk in social media about immortality being, the brash billionaire's wet dream kind of thing. So, but is cellular therapy in the real world really the first step towards a long life, if not immortality?
Yeah, immortality is something that is very, I think it's spoken about more than can be realized. There is a certain capacity, I think, that you can imagine that cellular therapy can be life extending. But for me as a physician, my quest is not towards at least immortality in the physical sense. I'm more interested in the immortality of ideas, the immortality of words, immortality of books. I'm still reading, with great reverence an English writer who lived 300 years ago, and we're still reading him in schools. I'm still reading Emily Dickinson, who's passed away, I don't know what, 100 and something odd years ago. So as far as physical immortality is concerned, I think that right now it doesn't fall within this ethical triangle I described. It doesn't fall in the triangle of extraordinary suffering. I'm not particularly interested in the extraordinary suffering of billionaires who are pining away for immortality. Longevity is a different thing. There are diseases that are associated with shortened lifespan. There are diseases that are associated with people who are getting older and older, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, immune collapse, collapse of the regenerative system of their blood. And certainly those illnesses in the elderly can be alleviated by cellular therapy. And I'm interested in all of that. I'm interested in longevity and the diseases that prevent from us having dignified longevity. But
not just living, yeah, living a lived
living
life.
For the sake of living.
Yes.
But immortality, as you say, as the wet dream of billionaires, is not of interest to me.
Tell us a bit more about the company you've established here in Bangalore along with Biocon.
Biocon is an investor in the company. We are not a subsidiary in any way. There are many investors in this company. The company is called Immunil. We are one of the first. There are some others, but we are certainly one of the first and among the leaders in bringing T-cell or CAR T-cell therapy, which is an entirely novel form of cellular therapy that can be curative, very important word, curative, for patients with relapsed refractory leukemias, lymphomas, and other diseases. These are often patients who are no longer responsive to whatever standard chemotherapies that are available. So therefore, their chances of dying from the disease are 100%. T cells, modified genetically engineered T cells, are capable of killing these cancers even after they have become relapsed and refractory. It is an incredible technology. We are in the process of developing our own proprietary T cells. I mean, making this is, I would say, akin to sending a rocket to the moon. The amount of work and the amount of detail orientedness that you need to develop T-cell, genetically engineered T-cell therapies for relapsed refractory leukemias and lymphomas and other diseases is extraordinary. I'm very proud to be part of this effort, and I'm very proud we announced our interim results. They're surprisingly, I would say, not surprisingly, I should say, they're astonishingly successful.
The clinical trials have been going on the past year, if I'm right.
Yeah, so we are the first to do a phase 2B clinical trial. These products are not just safe, we are evaluating their effectiveness. We have drawn strong standards about the effectiveness. So instead of sort of figuring out whether they're effective at a 1 month period, which is relatively meaningless, we're looking at effectiveness in the 90-day period, so at least 3 months, and then potentially going on to several years as the clinical trials mature in this space.
But as a company, how do you intend to address the elephant in the room? How to make cancer treatment more affordable?
So it is an elephant in the room. These therapies cost on the order of, if you count the associated care and if you count the price of the drug, if you count in the price of the previous chemotherapy, in the United States you're getting to $500,000 up to $800,000. So absurd numbers for certainly for Indians. We are trying every piece of ingenuity to bring the price down. That said, I said this is like sending a rocket to the moon. There is a certain floor beyond which it's right now, currently, we cannot bring the price down beyond that because we have to make a novel virus, we have to genetically engineer cells, we have to keep with the safety standards, we have to assure the regulators that our products are sterile, effective, and so forth. As a benchmark, let me give you a comparison. I don't know what the price is going to be. It will depend on where we can, as much as we can bring it and make it more affordable. But as a benchmark, let me tell you that at a accredited center in the world, the price of a bone marrow transplant in India is on the order of $30,000 odd. This therapy is more effective than that, less toxic than that, and a bone marrow transplant has those costs or prices because, again, there is a floor. There is a certain amount of work that is the bottom line that you have to do in terms of producing a bone marrow transplant. Finally, I should say to you that you should think of this effort, and I certainly do think of this effort, as the first step in a very long journey. If you never start the journey, we would have never built the first computer. The first computer was, cost several hundreds of millions of dollars in all making, not the computer itself, but in the process of making it. The first cell phone, costs, I don't know the price of the first cell phone was. I know the cost, by the way, of sequencing the first genome in humans was almost $1 billion. right? Now I'm sequencing genomes for $300, $400, $600, $800. So prices are almost always reduced as volume expands, as experience expands, and so the elephant in the room becomes smaller and smaller. And the idea is to ultimately make a small elephant, a baby elephant, rather than the big elephant.
I'll come to your writing process. I've noticed in earlier books also, you are not afraid to write emotionally. You write personal stories, you know. So, this must be a very difficult process as a doctor as well as a writer. You know, how do you deal with this?
Well, I think vulnerability as a writer is very important to all forms of writing, not just writing about medicine. I think if you are an invulnerable writer, you end up being a bad poet, you end up being a bad writer, you end up, it doesn't happen to be nothing to do with science writing, nothing to do with medical writing. People want to hear, readers want to know what your voice is, who are you? And it's ironically, the more vulnerable you are as a writer, the more readers trust you. Because they understand that you aren't, speaking to them from some lofty position, that in fact the things that affect their own lives affect you as well. Very famously in medicine, we have this perception of the doctor as some kind of omniscient, omnipotent figure who doesn't experience grief, doesn't experience challenges, is, carrying on mechanically. But in fact, that's not true. Medicine is a very complex profession, emotionally complex profession, and I want to explore all of that. Without that, I think I would be a lesser human being, let alone being a lesser writer.
What kind of a reader are you? Do you have any favorite authors?
Oh gosh, I'm a prolific reader. I read everything. I can, if you hand me a paper flyer, I'll read the paper flyer because I love to read. I have many favorite authors. I tend to like to read poetry a lot.
Right. Emily Dickinson is a favorite?
One of them, yeah. And often quote Emily Dickinson herself. I've made the requisite pilgrimage to her house. With my daughters, I went to Emily. It's in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And what's quite lovely is, we have all these imaginations about how people write. Emily Dickinson wrote on a desk overlooking a window. The desk is about this big.
Oh.
And from that desk, she reinvented modern poetry for
Absolutely.
all we know. Of course, I've been to Shakespeare's house at Stratford on Avon, and I have many favorite writers. Orwell, some more contemporary writers. So I read everything.
Yeah. And I've also read that you are trained in music, but you stopped yourself from singing because you said there is not enough grief in my music. Has anything changed?
Well, so yes, I was trained, and I actually continue to train in music. I have a jazz ensemble that I perform with. It's not jazz, I don't perform jazz, but Indian classical music, Hindustani music. I trained for many years, continue to train. Music is very much part of my life. I've always been interested in music. I listen to a lot of music, a lot of very different kinds of music. I, for instance, love flamenco. I love very fond of, obviously, Indian classical music, very fond of jazz, contemporary jazz, very fond of contemporary music.
Lovely.
So I have very broad tastes in both music and reading.
Yeah. But you don't perform because...
Actually, I do perform.
Yeah.
I perform anonymously.
I see.
And I perform with my jazz ensemble, which is called Jog Blues, J-O-G, Jog, from the rag Jog, blues from jazz.
Okay. Lovely talking to you, Dr. Mukherjee.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for watching.